Tonight, we'll delve into the daily life of an Ottoman harem concubine. Without further ado, let's begin our story. The first light of dawn filtered through the latticed windows of the harem quarters, casting delicate shadows across marble floors that had been polished to a mirror-like sheen by countless hands over the centuries. In a small chamber adorned with intricate tilework depicting gardens of paradise, a young woman named Layla stirred beneath silk coverlets that shimmered like captured moonlight. Her awakening was gentle, as it always was in this place where harsh sounds were forbidden, and every movement was choreographed to maintain the tranquil atmosphere that the Sultan's household demanded. Layla's eyes opened slowly, adjusting to the soft golden light that crept across the walls decorated with verses from poetry written in elegant calligraphy. She had been in the imperial harem for 3 years now, long enough for the routines to become second nature, yet short enough that she still sometimes woke wondering if this life of luxury and confinement was real or merely an elaborate dream from which she would eventually wake to find herself back in her father's modest house in the countryside of Anatolia. The sound of soft footsteps in the corridor beyond her door told her that the other women were already beginning their day. She could hear the gentle murmur of voices, speaking in the mixture of languages that filled the harem: Turkish, Arabic, Persian, Georgian, and others from lands she could barely imagine. Each woman brought with her the music of her homeland, creating a symphony of tongues that somehow harmonized in this place where women from across the empire found themselves united by their shared circumstances. Layla rose from her bed, her feet touching the cool marble that would soon warm under the morning sun streaming through the high windows. Her sleeping chamber was modest by the standards of the palace, yet it contained luxuries that would have seemed impossibly grand in her former life. The walls were covered in tiles of deep blue and gold, arranged in patterns that seemed to shift and dance in the changing light. A small fountain in the corner provided a constant, soothing sound of trickling water, and the air was perfumed with rose water that servants refreshed daily. She moved to the window, looking out through the carved stone screens that allowed her to see without being seen. The view showed one of the palace's many courtyards, where peacocks strutted across perfectly manicured lawns and fountain pools reflected the sky. Beyond the walls, she knew, lay Constantinople in all its bustling glory, but that world felt as distant as the stars. Her universe had contracted to these chambers, these corridors, these gardens where she and the other women lived their carefully circumscribed lives. A soft knock at her door announced the arrival of Gulnar, one of the older servants who had taken Layla under her wing when she first arrived. Gulnar was a woman whose own story had begun much like Layla's, but whose beauty had faded before she could catch the Sultan's attention, leading her to a life of service within the harem, rather than the possibility of advancement through imperial favor. She entered with a silver tray bearing a glass of sherbet made from pomegranates and rosewater, along with small pastries dusted with powdered sugar and filled with nuts and honey. "Good morning, little gazelle," Gulnar said, using the pet name she had given Layla in those early, frightening days when everything had seemed strange and overwhelming. "The Valide Sultan has requested that all the women gather in the main hall after the morning prayers. There are whispers that new fabrics have arrived from Damascus, and perhaps there will be gifts distributed. Layla accepted the sherbet gratefully, feeling the cool liquid ease the dryness in her throat. The routine of morning refreshment was one of the small pleasures that made each day bearable. Everything in the harem moved according to ritual and tradition, creating a sense of order that was both comforting and confining. She had learned that these rhythms were not arbitrary, but carefully designed to maintain harmony among women who might otherwise compete destructively for the attention that could mean the difference between a life of comfortable obscurity and one of power and influence. "What news from the outside?" Layla asked, though she knew that Gulnar would share only what was deemed appropriate for the women to know. Information flowed into the harem like water through a sieve, filtered and controlled by those who determined what knowledge might disturb the peace or inspire dangerous ambitions. The Sultan returned yesterday from his hunting expedition in the forests near Adrianople, Gulnar replied, arranging the pastries on a small mother-of-pearl table. "They say he brought back fine furs and that the expedition was successful. Perhaps this means he will be in good spirits and might call for entertainment in the coming days." This news sent a small thrill through Layla's chest, though she tried not to let it show on her face. In the 3 years since her arrival, she had been summoned to perform for the Sultan only twice, once to play the oud during a gathering of musicians, and once to recite poetry during a feast celebrating the birth of a prince to one of his favored wives. Each occasion had been both terrifying and exhilarating, offering a glimpse of the world beyond the harem walls and the possibility, however remote, of attracting the imperial attention that could transform her fate. After finishing her morning refreshment, Layla began the elaborate process of preparing for the day. Every aspect of a harem woman's appearance was carefully considered, from the arrangement of her hair to the selection of her garments. She opened the carved wooden chest that contained her clothing, running her fingers over fabrics that seemed too beautiful to be real. There were robes of silk so fine they felt like water, embroidered with threads of gold and silver in patterns that told stories of gardens and nightingales. There were shawls from cashmere, their softness beyond description, and veils of gossamer that caught light like spider webs touched by dew. She selected a robe of deep emerald silk, remembering how the color had caught the light during her last appearance before the Sultan. The garment had been a gift from the Valide Sultan, the Sultan's mother, who held ultimate authority over the harem and whose favor was essential for any woman hopping to advance her position. The robe fit perfectly, as all her clothing did, tailored by the palace seamstresses who were said to have skills that rivaled those of the angels. The process of dressing was itself a form of meditation, each layer of clothing adding to the transformation from the simple country girl she had once been to the polished, refined woman she had become. Over the silk robe went a vest of brocade, its surface shimmering with interwoven threads of gold. Around her waist, she tied a sash of crimson silk, and over her shoulders, she draped a shawl so delicate it seemed made of morning mist. Her reflection in the polished silver mirror showed her a figure she sometimes barely recognized. The girl who had once worked in her father's fields, whose hands had been rough from labor and whose skin had been darkened by the sun, had been transformed into something that seemed to belong in the illuminated manuscripts she had seen in the palace library. Her hair, now lustrous from treatments with oils and perfumes, was arranged in an elaborate style that required the assistance of Gulnar's practiced hands. "You grow more beautiful each day," Gulnar said as she worked, weaving small pearls into Layla's dark tresses. "Beauty is a gift from Allah, but it is also a responsibility. In this place, it can be either your salvation or your destruction, depending on how wisely you use it." These words, spoken so matter-of-factly, contain the essential truth of harem life that Layla had slowly come to understand. Beauty was currency here, but it was not the only form of value. Intelligence, musical skill, the ability to please through conversation or accomplishment, all of these could serve a woman's advancement. Yet beauty remained the foundation upon which all other attributes built their power. As Gulnar arranged the final pins in her hair, Layla thought about the other women she had known during her time in the harem. Some had arrived after her, young and frightened as she had been, while others had been residents for decades, their faces bearing the subtle marks of years spent in this golden cage. Each had her own story of arrival, her own dreams and fears, her own strategies for navigating the complex social hierarchies that governed their daily lives. There was Aish, barely 16, who had been presented to the harem by her family as tribute from a distant province. Her beauty was so striking that even the other women would pause to stare when she entered a room. But her youth and inexperience made her vulnerable to the subtle cruelties that could flourish in an environment where women competed for limited opportunities. Layla had taken it upon herself to guide Aish, remembering her own confusion and terror during those first weeks when every face had seemed potentially hostile and every gesture had carried hidden meanings. Then there was Safiyai, a woman of perhaps 30 who had once been among the Sultan's favorites but who had failed to produce a male heir, gradually watching her influence wane as younger women caught the imperial eye. Safiyai had responded to her changing circumstances by becoming a master of palace intrigue, using her knowledge of harem politics to maintain her position through alliances and careful manipulation of information. She was both feared and respected by the other women, and Layla had learned much from observing her methods, even while being careful never to become too closely associated with her schemes. The most fascinating of all the women, in Layla's opinion, was Mihrima, who had arrived from Persia 20 years earlier, and who had managed to carve out a unique position for herself through her extraordinary learning. Mihrima could read and write in 5 languages, compose poetry that moved listeners to tears, and engage in theological discussions that impressed even the palace scholars. Though she had never been chosen to share the Sultan's bed, her intellectual gifts had earned her the role of tutor to the royal children and advisor to the Valide Sultan on matters of culture and education. From Mihrima, Layla had learned that there were many forms of power within the harem, and that the women who survived and thrived were those who understood that their beauty was temporary, but their minds could serve them for a lifetime. Under Mihrima's guidance, Layla had begun to study not only the arts that were traditionally expected of harem women: music, dance, poetry recitation, but also history, geography, and the languages of the empire's various peoples. The morning call to prayer echoed across the palace complex, and Layla joined the other women in the small mosque that served the harem's spiritual needs. The act of prayer provided structure to each day and offered moments of genuine peace in lives that were otherwise filled with constant awareness of one's position relative to others. As she knelt on the prayer carpet, breathing in the scent of sandalwood incense, Layla often found herself reflecting on the strange paths that had brought her to this place. She had been born in a village whose name she was now forbidden to speak, the daughter of a man who grew olives and tended sheep in the hills of Anatolia. Her childhood had been one of simple pleasures and hard work, helping her mother with household tasks and watching her younger brothers play in the dust of their courtyard. The world beyond their village had seemed impossibly distant, existing only in the stories told by traveling merchants and the occasional tax collector, who represented the far-off authority of the Sultan. The change had come suddenly, as such changes always did. A delegation from the provincial governor's office had arrived in their village, ostensibly to assess tax obligations, but actually to identify young women of exceptional beauty for presentation to the imperial harem. Layla's selection had been both an honor and a tragedy for her family. An honor because it represented a chance for advancement and connection to the imperial court. A tragedy because it meant the loss of a beloved daughter and sister who would likely never be seen again. The journey to Constantinople had taken weeks, during which Layla had traveled in a covered cart with other selected girls, all of them terrified and homesick, but trying to maintain dignity in the face of their uncertain futures. They had been accompanied by guards and chaperones who maintained strict protocols to ensure that the girls arrived at the palace in perfect condition, untouched by the outside world that they were leaving forever. Her first sight of the palace complex had left her speechless with wonder and terror. The buildings seemed to stretch endlessly, their domes and minarets reaching toward heaven, while their walls enclosed spaces larger than her entire village. The imperial gate through which they passed was guarded by soldiers, whose uniforms were more magnificent than any clothing she had ever seen, and the courtyards they crossed were paved with stones that gleamed like jewels. The process of entry into the harem had been both humiliating and transformative. She had been examined by physicians to confirm her health and virtue, questioned by officials about her family and background, and evaluated by the harem's senior women, who would determine her initial placement within the complex hierarchy that governed life in the women's quarters. Throughout these proceedings, she had fought to maintain her composure, knowing that any sign of weakness or rebellion would mark her as unsuitable for the refined environment she was entering. The early months had been a blur of learning to walk with the gliding grace that was expected of harem women, learning to speak in the soft, melodious tones that pleased the ear, learning the complicated rules of precedence and protocol that determined who could speak to whom and when. She had studied Turkish with desperate intensity, knowing that her ability to communicate effectively could mean the difference between inclusion and isolation in this polyglot community. Most challenging of all had been learning to navigate the emotional landscape of harem life. The women around her were not merely competitors, but also her only companions, the sole human connections available to ease the loneliness of separation from her family and homeland. Forming friendships required delicate calculation. Too much trust could lead to betrayal. Too little could result in dangerous isolation. She had made mistakes in those early days, confiding too readily in women who later used her words against her, or failing to show proper respect to those whose positions in the hierarchy demanded deference. Gradually, however, she had found her place in this strange new world. Her natural intelligence and her willingness to learn had earned the attention of mentors like Mifrima, while her genuine kindness toward newer arrivals had built a network of allies among the younger women. She had discovered talents she never knew she possessed, a gift for music that allowed her to master several instruments, a memory that could retain complex poems and songs after only a few hearings, and a sensitivity to the emotional currents around her that helped her avoid many of the traps that snared less observant women. The years had brought small triumphs and bitter disappointments in roughly equal measure. There had been moments of recognition when her skills were acknowledged by the harem's senior women, invitations to participate in special ceremonies or entertainments that marked her growing status within the community. But there had also been times when other women had been selected for opportunities she had hoped for, when her efforts to attract favorable attention had gone unnoticed, when homesickness had threatened to overwhelm her carefully maintained composure. Through it all, she had held onto the hope that someday her situation might change dramatically. The stories of women who had risen from obscure positions to become powerful wives or mothers of princes were legendary within the harem, passed down like fairy tales that kept alive the dream of transformation. These stories were both inspiration and torment, offering the possibility of escape from the beautiful prison, while also highlighting how rare such escapes truly were. The morning prayers concluded, and the women began to make their way to the main hall where the Valide Sultan would address them. This gathering was one of the central rituals of harem life, a time when announcements were made, news was shared, and the community's collective identity was reinforced through shared experience. The hall itself was a marvel of architectural beauty, its walls covered in tiles that told the story of the empire's glorious history, while its ceiling soared overhead like the vault of heaven. As the women assembled, arranging themselves according to the subtle but rigid hierarchy that governed all their interactions, Layla found herself thinking about the complexity of the social structure that surrounded her. At the apex stood the Valide Sultan, the Sultan's mother, whose word was law within the harem, and whose influence extended throughout the palace and sometimes into matters of imperial policy. Below her were the Sultan's wives, ranked according to the order of their marriage and the status of any children they had produced. Next came the favorites, women who had shared the Sultan's bed and earned his temporary affection, but had not yet achieved the security of marriage. These women lived in constant anxiety, knowing that their positions depended entirely on maintaining the imperial interest, and that a single misstep or the arrival of a more attractive rival could end their brief moment of prominence. The majority of the harem's population consisted of women like herself, those who had been selected for their potential, but who remained unnoticed by the Sultan himself. They were divided into numerous gradations based on their length of service, their skills, their connections to more powerful women, and countless other factors that outsiders would find bewildering, but which were perfectly clear to those who lived within the system. At the bottom of the hierarchy were the newest arrivals and the servants, though even these positions offered more comfort and security than most women in the empire could hope for. The privilege of living in the imperial harem, even in the lowest capacity, was recognized throughout the realm as a mark of extraordinary fortune. The Valide Sultan entered the hall with the stately grace that befitted her position, her presence immediately commanding the complete attention of every woman present. She was a figure of remarkable dignity, her beauty now tempered by age but her authority undiminished by the passage of years. Her own story was legendary within the harem. She had arrived as a young girl from the Caucasus, had caught the eye of the previous sultan while he was still a prince, had borne him the son who now ruled the empire, and had used her position as mother of the sultan to become one of the most powerful women in the realm. She was accompanied by several of her most trusted advisors, women who had earned their positions through decades of loyal service, and whose counsel she valued in managing the complex community under her authority. These women served as her eyes and ears throughout the harem, monitoring the moods and activities of the residents, and reporting anything that might disturb the harmony essential to the community's proper functioning. "My daughters," the Valide Sultan began, her voice carrying easily throughout the hall despite its gentle tone, "I bring you greetings from His Imperial Majesty, who has returned safely from his expedition, and who speaks often of the beauty and accomplishments of the women of his household." A ripple of pleasure passed through the assembled women at these words. Any acknowledgement of their existence by the Sultan, even second-hand, was treasured as a sign that they remained in his thoughts and that opportunities for advancement might present themselves. "New fabrics have indeed arrived from Damascus," she continued, confirming the rumor that Gulnar had shared, "along with jewels from India and perfumes from Arabia. These gifts are tokens of His Majesty's appreciation for your devotion and your contributions to the glory of his household." The distribution of gifts was always a moment of high drama within the harem, as the quality and value of what each woman received served as a public indicator of her current status. Those who received the finest items could interpret this as a sign of growing favor, while those who were overlooked or given lesser gifts understood that their positions might be declining. Layla waited with the mixture of hope and anxiety that characterized such occasions, trying to maintain the serene expression that was expected while her heart raced with anticipation. When her name was called and she was presented with a length of silk whose deep blue color seemed to hold the essence of midnight sky, she accepted it with the graceful bow that protocol demanded, while inwardly celebrating what she hoped might be a positive sign. The fabric was of exceptional quality, its texture so fine that it seemed to flow like water through her fingers. More importantly, the color was one that she knew complemented her complexion perfectly, suggesting that whoever had selected it for her had given careful consideration to her appearance. This attention to detail, could indicate that her efforts to attract favorable notice were beginning to succeed. After the gift distribution, the Valide Sultan made several announcements regarding upcoming events in the palace calendar. There would be a celebration of the anniversary of the Sultan's accession to the throne, which would require special preparations and perhaps provide opportunities for some of the women to display their talents. Musicians would be needed for the entertainment, and there would be competitions in poetry recitation and dance. These announcements sent excitement through the hall as women began to calculate their chances of being selected to participate. For Layla, who had worked diligently to perfect her musical skills, the possibility of performing represented both an opportunity and a risk. A successful performance could elevate her status significantly, but a failure in so public a setting could damage her reputation permanently. As the gathering dispersed, the women clustering into small groups to discuss what they had heard, Layla found herself approached by Safiyai, the former favorite whose political acumen had kept her relevant despite her declining personal relationship with the Sultan. "The fabric suits you well," Safiyai said, her tone neutral but her eyes assessing. "The color choice suggests that someone with influence has taken notice of your potential." Layla thanked her for the observation, while remaining wary of reading too much significance into it. Safiyai was known for her ability to detect subtle currents in harem politics, but she was also capable of using such insights to further her own agenda. Any information she shared came with the implicit understanding that she expected something in return. "The anniversary celebration will offer many opportunities," Safiyai continued, "for those who are prepared to seize them. I have observed your musical practice, and your skills have grown considerably since your arrival. Perhaps we should discuss how best to ensure that these talents receive appropriate recognition." The invitation was carefully phrased, but its meaning was clear. Safiyai was offering to use her knowledge and connections to help advance Layla's position in exchange for an alliance that would strengthen Safiyai's own network of supporters. Such arrangements were common in harem life, where individual advancement often depended on one's ability to form strategic partnerships with other women. Layla promised to consider the proposal while avoiding any immediate commitment. She had learned to be cautious about aligning herself too closely with any particular faction within the harem, having seen how quickly alliances could shift and how association with a fallen favorite could damage one's own prospects. After the morning's formal activities, the women dispersed to pursue their individual occupations during the hours before the midday meal. For Layla, this time was devoted to practice and study, the activities that had become central to her strategy for advancement within the harem hierarchy. She made her way to one of the music rooms, a small chamber whose acoustics had been carefully designed to enhance the sound of voice and instrument. The walls were covered with panels of wood inlaid with mother-of-pearl in patterns that seemed to shift and dance as she moved, and the afternoon light filtering through high windows cast everything in a warm, golden glow. Her oud, a gift from Mihrima, who had recognized her musical potential, waited on its stand like a faithful friend. The instrument had been crafted by one of Constantinople's master luthiers, its wood aged to a deep amber, and its inlay work rivaling the finest jewelry. When she lifted it and began to tune its strings, the sound seemed to fill not just the room but her entire being, connecting her to the centuries of musicians who had used such instruments to express the inexpressible. She began with scales and exercises, warming her fingers and her voice while clearing her mind of the morning's excitements and anxieties. Music had become her refuge within the harem, the one activity that allowed her to transcend the limitations of her physical environment and touch something universal and eternal. When she played and sang, she could imagine herself back in her father's house, entertaining her family on feast days, or she could envision herself in the palaces of legendary queens, commanding the attention of sultans and kings. As her technical practice concluded, she turned to the repertoire she hoped to present if selected for the anniversary celebration. The songs she had chosen were drawn from various traditions within the empire, demonstrating both her versatility and her respect for the diverse cultural heritage that the harem represented. There was a Turkish folk song that told of a nightingale's love for a rose, its melody simple but heartbreakingly beautiful. There was a Persian ghazal whose complex rhythms and sophisticated poetry showcased her growing mastery of that language. And there was an Arabic makam whose spiritual intensity never failed to move her listeners to tears. Each piece required not just technical proficiency, but deep emotional understanding. The Nightingale's song demanded a delicate balance between joy and sorrow, celebrating love while acknowledging its transient nature. The ghazal needed intellectual precision combined with passionate expression, its intricate wordplay serving as a vehicle for profound emotion. The makam called for spiritual transcendence, using music as a pathway to divine understanding. As she practiced, Layla found herself thinking about the nature of her art and its relationship to her circumstances. Music in the harem served multiple purposes. It was entertainment for the Sultan and his guests, a form of spiritual expression for the women themselves, and a vehicle for individual advancement within the community hierarchy. The challenge lay in satisfying all these functions simultaneously, creating performances that pleased diverse audiences while remaining true to the emotional and artistic integrity of the material. The afternoon practice session was interrupted by the arrival of one of the younger women, Zainab, who had been in the harem for only 6 months and who still struggled with the adjustment to her new life. Zainab's homesickness was a palpable presence that followed her throughout the palace, and her efforts to master the skills expected of harem residents were hampered by her emotional state. "Please," Zainab said, her voice barely above a whisper, "could you teach me the song about the Garden of Roses? I have been trying to learn it, but I cannot make my voice carry the melody properly." Layla set aside her own practice without hesitation, remembering how isolated and desperate she had felt during her own early days in the harem. Teaching younger women had become one of her regular activities, partly from genuine compassion and partly from the recognition that building relationships with newer arrivals could prove valuable as they advanced within the community. The lesson that followed was as much about emotional support as musical instruction. As Layla guided Zainab through the song's intricate passages, she also shared the techniques she had developed for managing homesickness and anxiety. Music, she explained, could serve as a bridge between the world they had left behind and the world they now inhabited, allowing them to honor their past while building their future. The garden in this song exists only in our imagination, she told Zainab. But when we sing about it, we create it anew each time. In this place where we cannot walk in real gardens except those approved for us, we can cultivate gardens of memory and dreams that no one can take away. The metaphor seemed to resonate with the younger woman, and gradually her voice grew stronger and more confident as she began to understand that the song was not just a technical exercise, but a form of emotional expression that could help her process her complex feelings about her situation. Their lesson was observed by Gulnar, who appeared in the doorway with the silent grace that characterized all movement within the harem. Her presence was welcome rather than intrusive, as she often served as an informal mentor to the younger women, and her approval could be valuable for their advancement. The afternoon call to prayer approaches, Gulnar informed them quietly, and the Valide Sultan has requested that several of the younger women join her for refreshments afterward. Zainab, you are among those invited. This news brought a flush of excitement to Zainab's cheeks, as direct invitations from the Valide Sultan were rare honors that could signal developing interest in a woman's potential. Such invitations also represented opportunities to make impressions that could influence future opportunities for advancement. After the afternoon prayers, which provided another moment of spiritual centering in the day's rhythm, Layla found herself with a period of relative freedom before the evening meal. She chose to spend this time in the harem library, one of her favorite spaces within the palace complex, and one that set the Ottoman court apart from many others in its recognition of women's intellectual capabilities. The library was housed in a series of interconnected rooms whose walls were lined with manuscripts and books in dozens of languages. The collection included works of theology and law, poetry and literature, history and geography, medicine and astronomy. Many of the volumes were illuminated with miniature paintings of extraordinary beauty, their colors as vivid as the day they were created, and their artistic skill rivaling anything produced in the empire's workshops. Layla had become a regular visitor to the library during her years in the harem, initially drawn by curiosity and increasingly motivated by recognition that knowledge could serve as another form of currency in the complex social economy that governed their lives. Under Mifrima's guidance, she had learned to read Arabic and had begun to study Persian, opening up vast new territories of literature and learning. Today, she was drawn to a recently acquired collection of travel accounts, written by merchants and diplomats who had journeyed throughout the known world. These texts offered glimpses of lands and peoples that existed beyond the boundaries of the empire, feeding her curiosity about the wider world while also providing material that she might someday use in conversation with the Sultan or other palace officials. One account, written by a Venetian merchant who had traveled to India and beyond, described cities of impossible grandeur where spices grew wild in jungle clearings and precious stones, could be found lying in riverbeds like ordinary pebbles. Another, penned by a scholar who had visited the courts of European princes, painted pictures of castles perched on mountain peaks and forests so vast that travelers could walk for weeks without seeing the same landscape twice. As she read, Layla found herself imagining what it would be like to experience such journeys firsthand, to see with her own eyes the wonders that these authors described in such vivid detail. The longing for travel and adventure was one that she shared with many of the harem women, their physical confinement making the idea of unlimited movement seem impossibly precious. Yet she had also come to understand that there were different kinds of journeys available to her, even within the constraints of her current situation. Through books and learning, she could explore territories of the mind that were no less real for being invisible. Through music and poetry, she could visit emotional landscapes that offered their own forms of discovery and transformation. The library's atmosphere of scholarly quiet was interrupted by the soft sound of footsteps, and Layla looked up to see Mihrima approaching with the measured grace that characterized all her movements. The older woman's presence always brought a sense of calm authority, and her knowledge seemed so vast that Layla sometimes wondered if she had somehow absorbed the contents of every book in the collection. "I see you are exploring the travel literature," Mihrima observed, settling onto a cushion beside Layla with fluid elegance. "These accounts can be both inspiring and melancholy for those of us whose own travels have been circumscribed by circumstances." There was no bitterness in her tone, despite the acknowledgement of their shared confinement. Mihrima had long ago made peace with her situation and had found ways to create meaning and purpose within the boundaries of harem life. Her acceptance was neither passive nor resigned, but rather reflected a deep understanding of how to extract maximum fulfillment from available opportunities. "I find myself wondering about the women in these distant lands," Layla replied. "Do they live as we do, or have they found different arrangements between freedom and security?" It was the kind of question that might have been dangerous if posed to the wrong person, as it could be interpreted as criticism of their current circumstances. But Mihrima had always encouraged intellectual curiosity and philosophical speculation among her informal students, recognizing that mental stimulation was essential for maintaining sanity and dignity in their constrained environment. "From what these accounts suggest," Mihrima answered thoughtfully, "women everywhere face variations of the same fundamental challenges: how to find agency within structures of authority, how to create meaning within limitations, how to balance individual desires with social expectations. The specific forms these challenges take may vary, but the underlying human questions remain remarkably consistent." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a palace page, a young boy whose presence in the harem was permitted only because he had not yet reached the age when his masculinity would make him a prohibited intruder in the women's quarters. He carried a message written on paper whose quality and the elegant calligraphy immediately indicated its importance. "For the Lady Layla," he announced, offering the message with the formal bow that protocol required. "From the office of the Valide Sultan." Layla's heart began to race as she accepted the communication, recognizing that such direct correspondence was highly unusual and likely significant. Her hands trembled slightly as she unfolded the paper and read the carefully constructed phrases that conveyed their message with diplomatic precision. She was summoned to a private audience with the Valide Sultan the following morning, a meeting that would take place in the Valide Sultan's personal chambers rather than in any of the public spaces where most harem business was conducted. The purpose of the meeting was not specified, but the formal language and private setting suggested that matters of considerable importance would be discussed. The evening that followed the receipt of the message passed in a haze of nervous anticipation and careful preparation. Layla found it nearly impossible to concentrate on the usual activities that filled the hours between afternoon and night. The communal dinner in the Great Hall, the evening entertainment where women gathered to share music and conversation, the final prayers that marked the end of each day's prescribed activities. Her mind kept returning to the summons, turning over every possible interpretation of its meaning and significance. Gulnar, ever perceptive to the emotional currents that flowed through the harem, noticed Layla's distracted state and approached her as the women prepared for sleep. The older woman's experience had taught her to read the signs of palace intrigue and opportunity, and she recognized the symptoms of someone who had received unexpected attention from the harem's highest authority. "Whatever tomorrow brings," Gulnar said quietly as she helped Layla prepare for bed, "remember that the Valide Sultan values intelligence and composure above all other qualities. She has survived in this world longer than any of us, and her judgment is rarely mistaken. Trust in your own abilities, but also be prepared for possibilities you may not have considered." The advice was both reassuring and unsettling, confirming Layla's sense that the morning's meeting would be significant while offering no clues about what form that significance might take. She spent much of the night lying awake, staring at the patterns of moonlight that filtered through her window screens, and listening to the soft sounds of the palace settling into its nighttime quietude. Sleep, when it finally came, brought dreams of her childhood home mixed with visions of throne rooms and imperial ceremonies. She found herself walking through landscapes that shifted between the olive groves of her father's land and the marble corridors of the palace, pursued by a sense of urgency whose source she could not identify. When she woke with the first light of dawn, she felt as though she had been traveling all night rather than resting. The morning preparations took on special significance as she selected her clothing and arranged her appearance for the crucial meeting. Every choice seemed fraught with potential meaning: the color of her robe, the style of her hair, the jewelry she chose to complement her outfit. She settled on garments that conveyed respect for the formality of the occasion, while also subtly emphasizing her own beauty and refinement. The robe she selected was made from the blue silk she had received as a gift the previous day, its color deepened by the morning light to something approaching the shade of sapphires. Over it, she wore a vest of cream-colored brocade, whose subtle gold threads caught the light without appearing ostentatious. Her hair was arranged in a style that Mifrima had taught her, complex enough to demonstrate skill and attention to detail, while remaining elegant rather than elaborate. Gulnar assisted with the final touches, applying kohl to emphasize Layla's eyes and a trace of rose oil to her lips and cheeks. The cosmetics were applied with restraint, enhancing natural beauty rather than creating an artificial mask. In the harem, where subtlety was often more powerful than obvious display, the art of understatement had been refined to extraordinary levels. As the appointed hour approached, Layla made her way through corridors she had traversed countless times, but which now seemed charged with new significance. The route to the Valide Sultan's private chambers led through some of the palace's most beautiful spaces, past fountains whose water sang over marble carved by master craftsmen, and through gardens where flowers had been arranged to create living poems of color and fragrance. The guards stationed at various checkpoints recognized her and allowed her passage without question, their presence serving as a reminder of the security that surrounded the harem's most important residents. These men, specially selected for their loyalty and discretion, formed an invisible barrier between the women's quarters and the outside world, ensuring that the privacy essential to harem life remained inviolate. At the entrance to the Valide Sultan's chambers, Layla was met by one of the senior attendants, a woman whose own story reflected decades of faithful service and whose demeanor suggested both kindness and uncompromising standards. After a brief inspection to ensure that Layla's appearance met the expectations appropriate to the meeting, she was escorted into the presence of the most powerful woman in the empire. The Valide Sultan's private receiving room was smaller than the public halls where she normally held court, but its intimacy only served to emphasize the luxury of its appointments. The walls were covered with panels of rare wood inlaid with precious stones in patterns that seemed to flow like frozen music. Carpets from the finest workshops of Isfahan covered the floor in layers of incredible softness, their colors so vivid they seemed to glow with internal light. The Valide Sultan herself was seated on a low divan surrounded by cushions whose silk covers had been embroidered with threads of gold and silver. Despite the early hour, she was dressed with full ceremony, her robes arranged with the precision that befitted her rank, while her jewelry served as a reminder of the wealth and power that flowed through the imperial household. "Approach, my daughter," she said, her voice carrying the authority that had guided the harem for more than 2 decades. "Be seated, and let us speak together of matters that concern your future and the welfare of this household." Layla moved forward with the gliding steps that had become second nature during her years in the palace, settling onto the cushion indicated by the Valide Sultan's gesture, while maintaining the respectful posture that protocol demanded. The proximity to such concentrated power was both thrilling and intimidating, like standing near a fire that could provide warmth and light or consume everything in its path. "I have been observing your progress during your time among us," the Valide Sultan continued, her eyes studying Layla with the penetrating gaze of someone accustomed to evaluating human character and potential. "Your musical skills have developed considerably, your conduct has been exemplary, and your intelligence appears to exceed what your background might have suggested." The words were delivered in a measured tone that revealed nothing of the speaker's ultimate intentions, but Layla felt a surge of pride at this acknowledgement of her efforts. Recognition from the Valide Sultan represented the highest form of approval available within the harem, and the fact that her development had been noted suggested that opportunities for advancement might be forthcoming. Your teachers speak highly of your aptitude for languages, the Valide Sultan went on. Mihrama tells me that your Persian has progressed rapidly and that you show promise in Arabic as well. These skills, combined with your musical abilities, suggest that you might be suitable for responsibilities beyond those typically assigned to women of your current status. Now Layla's heart began to race with genuine excitement as the implications of these words became clear. Advanced responsibilities within the harem often meant closer proximity to the Sultan himself, opportunities to participate in diplomatic functions where linguistic skills were valuable, or assignments that could lead to the kind of visibility that might result in imperial favor. His Imperial Majesty has expressed interest in expanding the cultural programs that entertain visiting dignitaries, the Valide Sultan explained. The empire's reputation for sophistication and learning is enhanced when our guests witness the accomplishments of the palace household. Women who can perform with distinction while also serving as examples of the refinement that characterizes our court play important roles in these diplomatic functions. The mention of the Sultan's direct interest sent a thrill through Layla that she struggled to keep from showing on her face. After 3 years of hopping for some form of recognition from the imperial presence that dominated all their lives while remaining tantalizingly distant, the possibility of actually serving his interests in a meaningful way seemed almost too wonderful to believe. I would be honored to serve in whatever capacity your Majesty deems appropriate, Layla replied, her voice carefully modulated to convey enthusiasm without appearing presumptuous. My skills and my loyalty are entirely at the disposal of the imperial household. Excellent, the Valide Sultan said, and for the first time, her stern expression softened into something approaching a smile. There will be a reception in 10 days' time for an embassy from the Safavid court. The Persian ambassador has specifically requested entertainment that demonstrates our appreciation for his country's cultural contributions to the Islamic world. You will be among the performers selected to represent our household on this occasion. The magnitude of this opportunity was overwhelming. To perform before foreign diplomats in the presence of the Sultan himself would be the most significant moment of her life since her arrival at the palace. Success could elevate her status dramatically, while failure would likely end any hopes for future advancement. The stakes could hardly be higher, and the time available for preparation was limited. The performance will require not only musical skill, but also the ability to engage in conversation with our guests, the Valide Sultan continued. The ambassador is known to be a man of learning who appreciates sophisticated discourse on topics ranging from poetry to philosophy. Your preparation must therefore encompass both artistic and intellectual dimensions. As the details of the assignment became clear, Layla realized that this was far more than a simple musical performance. She was being entrusted with a role that combined entertainment with diplomacy, requiring her to serve as a representative of Ottoman culture, while also demonstrating respect for Persian traditions. The complexity of the task was daunting, but it also represented exactly the kind of opportunity she had dreamed of since her arrival. The remainder of the meeting was devoted to practical arrangements, the selection of repertoire, coordination with other performers, protocols for interaction with foreign guests, and expectations regarding dress and deportment. Each detail was specified with precision, reflecting the Valide Sultan's understanding that successful diplomatic entertainment required meticulous planning and flawless execution. When the audience concluded, Layla emerged into the morning sunlight feeling as though she had been transformed overnight from an obscure harem resident into a player in the great game of imperial politics. The responsibility was sobering, but the excitement was undeniable. For the first time since her arrival, she had a clear path toward the kind of recognition that could change her life fundamentally. The news of her selection spread quickly through the harem, as such information always did in a community where everyone's fate was interconnected, and where changes in one woman's status could create ripple effects throughout the hierarchy. The reactions were predictably mixed, ranging from genuine congratulations from friends like Gulnar and Mihrima, to barely concealed envy from women who had hoped for such opportunities themselves. Safiai's response was characteristically complex, offering praise for Layla's achievement while also positioning herself to benefit from association with the newly favored woman. "Your success brings honor to all of us," she said when they encountered each other in one of the garden courtyards. "I hope you will remember your friends when your elevated position provides opportunities to extend favors." The subtle request for future consideration was exactly what Layla had expected, and she responded with the diplomatic ambiguity that such situations required. Maintaining relationships throughout the harem would remain important regardless of how her circumstances changed, but she was also careful not to make commitments that might prove problematic later. Mihrima's reaction was more straightforward and considerably more helpful. "This opportunity represents everything you have worked toward," she said as they sat together in the library that afternoon. "Your preparation must be comprehensive, covering not only the technical aspects of performance, but also the cultural and historical knowledge that will allow you to engage meaningfully with sophisticated guests." The older woman's offer to assist with preparation was invaluable, and they immediately began planning an intensive program of study and practice that would occupy every available moment during the 10 days remaining before the reception. The challenge was formidable, but Layla felt more motivated than she had ever been in her life. The days that followed passed in a blur of concentrated activity. Her mornings were devoted to musical practice, refining the Persian compositions that would form the core of her performance, while also preparing Turkish and Arabic pieces that might be requested. The technical demands were considerable, requiring not only flawless execution, but also the kind of emotional expression that would move listeners who were themselves connoisseurs of musical art. Her afternoons were spent in intensive study with Mihrima, reviewing Persian literature and philosophy to ensure that she could participate intelligently in whatever conversations might arise during the reception. The Persian cultural tradition was vast and sophisticated, encompassing poetry, that explored the deepest questions of human existence and philosophical systems that had influenced Islamic thought for centuries. Remember that the ambassador represents the Safavid court, which prides itself on being the guardian of Persian culture, Mihrima explained during one of their sessions. He will be looking for evidence that we truly understand and appreciate the intellectual heritage his country has contributed to our shared Islamic civilization. Superficial knowledge will be immediately apparent and potentially insulting. The evenings were devoted to discussions with other women who had experience in diplomatic entertainments, learning about the protocols and expectations that govern such events. These conversations revealed the complexity of what she was undertaking. Every gesture, every word, every detail of presentation would be scrutinized not only by the Persian guests, but also by palace officials who would be evaluating her performance for signs of the empire's cultural sophistication. As the day of the reception approached, Layla found herself experiencing a mixture of excitement and terror that made sleep nearly impossible. The opportunity she had dreamed of was finally within reach, but the magnitude of the challenge was almost overwhelming. Everything she had worked for during her years in the palace would be tested in a single evening, whose outcome could determine the entire course of her future. The day of the reception dawned clear and bright, as if the weather itself was conspiring to create perfect conditions for the momentous event. Layla woke before dawn, too nervous to remain in bed, and spent the early morning hours in prayer and meditation, seeking the inner calm that would be essential for the performance ahead. The preparations began immediately after the morning meal, with teams of servants and attendants working to transform the designated reception hall into a setting worthy of imperial diplomacy. Carpets of extraordinary beauty were arranged to create intimate spaces for conversation, while platforms for the musical performances were positioned to provide optimal acoustics and visibility. Layla's own preparation was equally elaborate, involving not only her usual careful attention to dress and cosmetics, but also final rehearsals with the other performers who would participate in the evening's entertainment. The musical ensemble included some of the harem's most accomplished artists, women whose skills had been refined through years of practice, and whose experience in diplomatic functions would help ensure the success of the overall presentation. As the afternoon wore on and the time for the reception drew near, Layla could feel the nervous energy building throughout the palace. Servants hurried through corridors carrying final preparations. Guards took their positions at strategic locations, and the harem's residents who would not be participating in the evening's events gathered to offer encouragement and support. The arrival of the Persian embassy was announced by a fanfare of trumpets that echoed across the palace complex, followed by the measured procession that brought the guests through the courtyards and reception halls toward the space where they would be entertained. From her position in a chamber adjacent to the main hall, Layla could hear the sounds of formal greetings and diplomatic courtesies as the Sultan welcomed his guests with the ceremony appropriate to their status. The Persian ambassador, when she finally saw him, proved to be a man of evident cultivation and dignity, his bearing reflecting both the authority of his position and the refined manners that characterized the Safavid court. He was accompanied by several members of his delegation, each of whom displayed the sophisticated dress and urbane demeanor that marked them as representatives of one of the Islamic world's great cultural centers. When the moment came for the entertainment to begin, Layla felt a strange sense of calm descend over her, as if all the nervous energy of the preceding days had crystallized into focused concentration. She took her place on the performance platform with the fluid grace that had become second nature, her oud cradled in her arms like a beloved companion, her voice ready to serve the music that would carry her message to the assembled dignitaries. The first piece she performed was a classical Persian ghazal, whose intricate melody and sophisticated poetry had been chosen specifically to demonstrate the Ottoman court's appreciation for Persian cultural achievement. As her voice rose and fell with the ancient rhythms, weaving together the instrumental accompaniment and the poetic text into a unified expression of beauty and longing, she could see the ambassador's face soften with recognition and approval. The performance continued with pieces that showcased not only her musical abilities, but also the breadth of her cultural knowledge. A Turkish folk song demonstrated her connection to the Ottoman tradition, while an Arabic makam revealed her understanding of the spiritual dimensions of Islamic art. Each piece was received with evident appreciation, and she could sense the growing satisfaction of the Ottoman officials who were observing the diplomatic impact of the evening's entertainment. But the most challenging moment came not during the formal performance but afterward, when protocol required the performers to engage in conversation with the guests. This was the test that Mihrima had prepared her for most carefully, the opportunity to demonstrate that her accomplishments extended beyond mere technical skill, to encompass the intellectual sophistication that marked true cultural achievement. The Persian ambassador approached her with the courtesy that befitted the occasion, his manner suggesting both diplomatic formality and genuine interest in the conversation that was about to unfold. "Your performance of the ghazal by Hafez was particularly moving," he said, speaking in Persian whose elegant phrasing immediately revealed his own literary education. "The way you interpreted the poet's treatment of divine love disguised as earthly passion showed remarkable understanding of the work's deeper meanings." Layla felt a surge of gratitude toward Mihrima, whose intensive preparation had included detailed analysis of exactly this poem and its place within Persian literary tradition. Her response was carefully crafted to demonstrate both respect for the ambassador's knowledge and confidence in her own understanding. The great master's ability to use the language of human love to explore spiritual truth has always moved me deeply, she replied. His poetry reminds us that the boundaries between earthly and divine affection are more permeable than we often realize, and that true understanding comes only when we recognize the sacred dimensions of all genuine feeling. The ambassador's eyebrows rose slightly at this response, a sign that he had not expected such philosophical sophistication from a performer in the Ottoman court. His next questions probed deeper into Persian literary tradition, testing her knowledge of other poets and her ability to discuss the evolution of mystical themes in Islamic literature. As the conversation continued, Layla found herself entering a state of intellectual excitement that rivaled the artistic satisfaction of her musical performance. The years of study with Mihrama were paying dividends she had not anticipated, allowing her to engage with one of the Islamic world's leading cultural figures as something approaching an equal, rather than merely an entertainer seeking approval. The dialogue ranged across topics that encompassed poetry and philosophy, theology and history, the relationship between Persian and Turkish cultural traditions, and the ways in which artistic expression could serve diplomatic understanding between neighboring Islamic empires. With each exchange, Layla could sense not only the ambassador's growing respect, but also the attention of the Ottoman officials who were witnessing this demonstration of their court's cultural sophistication. The evening's formal conclusion came with expressions of mutual appreciation and diplomatic courtesy that masked the deeper significance of what had transpired. For the Persian delegation, the reception had provided evidence of the Ottoman court's genuine appreciation for Persian culture and its commitment to maintaining the intellectual traditions that linked the Islamic world together. For the Ottoman officials, the event had demonstrated their ability to match the cultural sophistication of any rival court, while also showcasing the accomplishments of their own household. But for Layla, the evening represented a transformation that went far beyond diplomatic success. In the space of a few hours, she had moved from the margins of palace life to a position where her abilities were recognized at the highest levels of imperial authority. The risks she had taken in pursuing intellectual and artistic development had been vindicated in the most dramatic way possible. The aftermath of the reception brought changes that rippled through every aspect of her daily life. Her quarters were relocated to rooms that reflected her elevated status, with better furnishings and more privacy than she had previously enjoyed. Her clothing allowance was increased, permitting her to dress in a manner appropriate to someone who might be called upon to represent the court in future diplomatic functions. Most importantly, her access to the palace's cultural and intellectual resources was expanded significantly. She was granted permission to use the main library at any time, rather than only during designated hours for harem residents. Her musical practice could now take place in rooms with superior acoustics, and she was provided with instruments of the highest quality to support her continued development as a performer. The attention she received from the other harem residents was equally dramatic, though more complex in its implications. Women who had previously regarded her as a peer now approached her with the deference appropriate to someone whose position had been elevated through imperial favor. This change in status brought both advantages and challenges, as she found herself navigating relationships that had been fundamentally altered by her success. Gulnar's reaction was unambiguously positive, reflecting both genuine affection and satisfaction at seeing her guidance bear fruit. "You have become what I always believed you could become," she said during one of their private conversations. "But remember that success in this world requires constant vigilance. What has been given can also be taken away, and your position now depends on maintaining the standards that brought you to imperial attention." Mihrama's response combined pride in her student's achievement with recognition of the new responsibilities that accompanied elevated status. You have proven that intellectual development can serve practical purposes even in the most unlikely circumstances, she observed. Your success demonstrates to all the women here that there are many paths to advancement, and that cultivation of the mind can be as valuable as more obvious forms of attractiveness. Safiai's reaction was more calculating, as Layla had expected. The older woman immediately began positioning herself to benefit from association with the newly favored resident, offering her services as a guide to the complex politics that governed life at higher levels of the harem hierarchy. Your elevation brings both opportunities and dangers, Safiai warned during a carefully orchestrated encounter in one of the garden courtyards. Those who have achieved positions like yours must be constantly aware of rivals who might seek to undermine their standing. Alliance with experienced allies becomes essential for maintaining hard-won advantages. The offer of alliance was both tempting and troubling, as Layla recognized that Safiai's support could indeed prove valuable, while also understanding that such partnerships came with obligations that might prove burdensome. She chose to acknowledge the offer without making immediate commitments, preferring to evaluate her new situation more thoroughly before entering into binding relationships. The most significant change, however, came in the form of increased attention from the Sultan himself. 3 days after the reception, she received a summons to perform at a private gathering in the Sultan's personal chambers, an honor that represented the highest form of recognition available to a harem resident. The invitation was delivered with the same formal protocols that had characterized her first audience with the Valide Sultan, but the implications were far more momentous. To perform in the Sultan's private chambers meant entering the inner sanctum of imperial power, where the empire's most crucial decisions were made, and where proximity to ultimate authority offered possibilities that existed nowhere else in the realm. The preparation for this performance required even more intensive effort than had been devoted to the diplomatic reception. Every detail of repertoire, dress, and deportment was scrutinized by the harem's most experienced advisors, as the stakes involved in pleasing the Sultan directly were immeasurably higher than those associated with entertaining foreign guests. The selection of music presented particular challenges, as the Sultan's personal tastes were known to be both sophisticated and idiosyncratic. He preferred compositions that combined technical brilliance with emotional depth, pieces that could serve as background for contemplation, while also commanding attention when he chose to listen actively. The balance between these requirements demanded careful judgment and extensive rehearsal. The evening of the private performance found Layla in a state of nervous anticipation that surpassed even what she had experienced before the diplomatic reception. The success or failure of this single event could determine not only her immediate future, but the entire trajectory of her life within the palace. Everything she had worked for since her arrival 3 years earlier would be tested in the space of a few hours. The Sultan's private chambers were smaller than the grand halls where public ceremonies took place, but their intimate scale only served to emphasize the concentration of power that filled the space. The man who ruled one of the world's great empires was present in person, close enough for conversation, focused entirely on evaluating her worth as a performer and potentially as something more. When she began to perform, singing a composition that wove together Turkish, Persian, and Arabic musical traditions into a seamless expression of the empire's cultural synthesis, she could see the Sultan's attention focus with the intensity that had made him one of history's most successful rulers. His evaluation was not casual entertainment, but serious assessment of someone who might be called upon to represent his court in future diplomatic and cultural contexts. The performance concluded to evident imperial satisfaction, but the evening's most significant moment came afterward, when protocol permitted brief conversation between the performer and her audience. The Sultan's questions revealed not only his appreciation for her musical abilities, but also his awareness of her intellectual development and her potential for broader contributions to the palace's cultural life. "The Valide Sultan speaks highly of your progress in languages and learning," he said, his voice carrying the authority that commanded the obedience of millions, while also suggesting the refined manners that characterized his personal interactions. Such accomplishments are rare and valuable in a world where cultural sophistication serves the empire's diplomatic interests. The conversation that followed touched on topics ranging from music and poetry to the broader questions of cultural policy that occupied the imperial administration. Layla found herself once again drawing on the preparation that Mihrima had provided, but now the stakes were immeasurably higher as she engaged with the ultimate source of authority in the realm. As the evening concluded, the Sultan made an observation that would prove prophetic for Layla's future development. Intelligence and artistic ability, when combined with discretion and loyalty, can serve the empire in ways that extend far beyond mere entertainment. We will have occasion to call upon your services again. The implications of these words would become clear only gradually, as Layla's position within the palace hierarchy continued to evolve in response to her demonstrated abilities and the imperial recognition they had earned. But even in that moment, she understood that her life had been transformed in ways that would have seemed impossible when she first arrived as a frightened girl from an Anatolian village. The months that followed brought a series of opportunities and responsibilities that confirmed her elevation to a position of genuine influence within the palace community. She was called upon to perform for visiting dignitaries from various parts of the Islamic world, each occasion requiring careful preparation and flawless execution. Her success in these diplomatic functions led to additional responsibilities that gradually expanded her role from entertainer to cultural ambassador. Her daily routine evolved to reflect these new duties. The morning hours were still devoted to musical practice, but now her sessions were guided by master musicians brought from throughout the empire to ensure that her skills continued to develop at the highest levels. Her afternoons were spent in study that encompassed not only languages and literature, but also history, geography, and the complex web of relationships that connected the Ottoman Empire to its neighbors and rivals. The evenings brought social obligations that had previously been beyond her reach. She was invited to gatherings where the palace's intellectual elite discussed questions of policy and culture, contributing to conversations that sometimes influenced decisions made at the highest levels of imperial administration. Her opinions on cultural and diplomatic matters began to carry weight, and she found herself consulted by officials who recognized the value of her insights. Perhaps most significantly, her relationship with the Sultan evolved from that of performer and audience to something approaching intellectual partnership in matters related to cultural policy. She was called upon to advise on questions ranging from the selection of court musicians to the planning of diplomatic entertainments that would demonstrate the empire's sophistication to foreign observers. This evolution brought both satisfaction and anxiety, as she recognized that her elevated position made her a target for those who might resent her success or seek to use her influence for their own purposes. The lessons in palace politics that Safiyye had offered became increasingly relevant as she navigated relationships with individuals whose own ambitions might conflict with her interests. The complexity of her situation was highlighted during a reception for ambassadors from several European courts, an event that required her to demonstrate not only her musical abilities, but also her capacity to engage diplomatically with representatives of Christian powers, whose relationship with the Islamic world was often tense and complicated. The challenge was considerable, as she had to find ways to showcase Ottoman cultural achievement while also showing respect for the traditions that the foreign guests represented. The musical program she developed included pieces that demonstrated the sophisticated synthesis of influences that characterized Ottoman court culture, while her conversations with the ambassadors required careful navigation of religious and political sensitivities that could easily give offense if handled clumsily. The success of this event led to recognition that extended beyond the palace walls, as reports of the evening's cultural diplomacy reached courts throughout Europe and enhanced the Ottoman Empire's reputation for sophisticated governance and refined cultural achievement. For Layla personally, the event marked her emergence as a figure of genuine diplomatic significance, whose contributions to imperial policy were recognized at the highest levels. As her fourth year in the palace drew to a close, Layla found herself reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had brought her from rural obscurity to a position of influence within one of the world's great courts. The frightened girl who had arrived knowing only Turkish and possessing only rudimentary musical skills had been transformed into a woman whose linguistic abilities, cultural knowledge, and diplomatic experience made her valuable to the empire's most important initiatives. Yet the transformation had come at costs that were only gradually becoming apparent. The life she had left behind in Anatolia now seemed not merely distant but almost fictional, as if it had been lived by someone else entirely. Her family, from whom she had received no communication since her departure, existed now only in memories that were beginning to fade despite her efforts to preserve them. The relationships she had formed within the palace, while genuine in their own way, were inevitably shaped by the competitive dynamics that governed life in an environment where everyone's position depended on maintaining favor with those above them in the hierarchy. Even her closest friendships carried undertones of calculation and strategic thinking that would have been impossible in the simpler world she had known as a child. Most challenging of all was the recognition that her elevated position, while bringing privileges and satisfactions she had never imagined, also carried responsibilities and pressures that were beginning to affect her in ways she was only starting to understand. The constant need to maintain performance standards worthy of imperial attention, the requirement to navigate complex political relationships without making enemies, the pressure to continue advancing lest she be perceived as stagnating. All of these demands created a form of stress that was as exhausting as it was invisible to outside observers. The weight of these realizations became particularly acute during the winter months of her fourth year, when the reduced schedule of diplomatic activities provided more time for introspection and self-examination. The palace's rhythm slowed during the coldest months, with fewer visitors and more emphasis on internal cultural activities that maintained the community's cohesion during the season of isolation from the outside world. It was during this quieter period that Layla began to understand more deeply the psychological complexities of life at the heights of imperial society. The constant performance required to maintain her position had become so ingrained that she sometimes found it difficult to distinguish between her authentic self and the persona she had developed for public presentation. The skills that had elevated her, the ability to please diverse audiences, to navigate complex social situations, to present herself as the embodiment of Ottoman cultural refinement, had become so fundamental to her identity that she wondered what would remain if they were stripped away. These questions took on particular urgency during a conversation with Mihrima, whose own long experience in the palace had given her insights into the psychological toll of sustained success at the highest levels of court life. They were sitting in the library during one of the quiet afternoons that characterized the winter season, surrounded by manuscripts whose authors had grappled with similar questions about the relationship between public achievement and private authenticity. "I have been watching you carefully during these past months," Mihrima said, her voice carrying the gentle authority that had made her such an effective mentor. "Your success has been extraordinary, and your contributions to the empire's cultural diplomacy have been genuinely significant. But I also see signs of the strain that such achievements inevitably create." The older woman's observations touched on fears that Layla had been reluctant to acknowledge even to herself. The constant pressure to exceed previous performances, the need to maintain relationships with individuals whose motivations were not always transparent, the requirement to represent not only herself, but the entire Ottoman cultural tradition in her interactions with foreign dignitaries. All of these responsibilities had created a form of existential exhaustion that no amount of physical rest could address. "The paradox of advancement in this world," Mihrima continued, "is that each success creates new obligations that make the next success both more necessary and more difficult to achieve. The woman who performs adequately can remain comfortable in obscurity, But the woman who excels finds herself trapped in a cycle of escalating expectations that can become impossible to satisfy. This analysis resonated deeply with Layla's own experience, helping her to understand why her recent achievements had brought anxiety alongside satisfaction. The diplomatic receptions that had once represented exciting opportunities now felt like examinations where failure would mean not just personal disappointment, but potential damage to the empire's reputation. The conversations with imperial officials that had initially thrilled her with their implications of influence and importance now carried the weight of responsibility for outcomes that could affect relationships between great powers. The winter months also provided opportunities for deeper reflection on the spiritual dimensions of her situation. The reduced schedule of external obligations allowed more time for prayer and contemplation, activities that had sometimes been crowded out by the demands of her rising position within the palace hierarchy. As she spent more time in meditation and study of religious texts, she began to grapple with questions about the relationship between worldly achievement and spiritual development that had been largely theoretical during her years of intense focus on advancement. The Islamic tradition offered rich resources for understanding these dilemmas, particularly in the mystical literature that explored the tension between engagement with the material world and devotion to transcendent spiritual values. The poets whose work she had studied for its artistic and cultural significance revealed new depths when approached as guides to the inner life, offering perspectives on questions of ambition, attachment, and the search for meaning that spoke directly to her current circumstances. One text that proved particularly meaningful was a collection of meditations by a Sufi master who had served in various courts throughout the Islamic world, before retiring to a life of contemplation and teaching. His reflections on the challenges faced by those who sought to serve, both worldly and spiritual masters, provided a framework for understanding her own struggles with the competing demands of imperial duty and personal authenticity. The servant of earthly rulers, the master had written, finds that each success binds him more tightly to the wheel of obligation, until he discovers that what he thought was advancement has become a form of imprisonment. Yet this very recognition can serve as the beginning of true wisdom, if it leads him to seek a different kind of success that liberates rather than constrains. These words suggested possibilities that Layla had not previously considered, ways of engaging with her position that might allow her to fulfill her obligation while also maintaining connection to deeper sources of meaning and satisfaction. The challenge lay in finding practical applications for such insights within the concrete circumstances of palace life, where theoretical wisdom had to be translated into daily decisions about how to behave and what priorities to embrace. Her exploration of these questions was deepened by conversations with other palace residents who had grappled with similar dilemmas during their own careers in imperial service. These discussions revealed that the psychological challenges she was experiencing were common among those who achieved significant positions within the Ottoman hierarchy, and that successful navigation of these challenges often required fundamental reassessment of one's goals and methods. One particularly valuable conversation took place with an older eunuch who had served in various administrative capacities throughout the palace complex for more than 30 years. His perspective combined intimate knowledge of imperial politics with the wisdom that comes from observing the rise and fall of countless individuals who had sought advancement within the system. The secret to maintaining sanity in this world, he told her during one of their clandestine meetings in a seldom-used garden pavilion, is to remember that all earthly positions are temporary, while the qualities of character that enable us to serve effectively are permanent. Those who focus on preserving their positions inevitably lose them, while those who focus on developing their capabilities often find that positions seek them out. This advice proved prophetic in ways that became apparent during the spring of her 5th year in the palace, when changes in the broader political situation created new opportunities and challenges that tested both her accumulated skills and her evolving understanding of how to maintain authenticity while serving imperial interests. The catalyst for these changes was the arrival of a new ambassador from the Mughal Empire, whose court in India represented one of the Islamic world's most sophisticated cultural centers. The ambassador, a man of extraordinary learning whose reputation for intellectual brilliance had preceded his arrival, requested entertainment that would demonstrate the Ottoman court's appreciation for the philosophical and artistic traditions that connected the various Islamic empires. The challenge this request presented was unlike anything Layla had previously encountered. The Mughal court's cultural sophistication was legendary throughout the Islamic world, and its representatives were known to be connoisseurs whose standards were impossibly high. A successful performance would enhance the Ottoman Empire's reputation significantly, while failure would reflect poorly not only on her personally, but on the court's claims to cultural leadership within the broader Islamic civilization. The preparation required for this event demanded not only her usual intensive study and practice, but also collaboration with scholars and artists from throughout the palace community. She found herself working closely with historians who could provide context for the cultural exchanges between the Ottoman and Mughal empires, theologians who could ensure that her presentations demonstrated proper understanding of Islamic intellectual traditions, and linguists who could help her perfect her command of the Persian and Arabic texts that would form the foundation of her performance. The collaborative nature of this preparation process revealed new dimensions of palace life that had been largely hidden from her during her previous focus on individual advancement. The Ottoman court, she discovered, contained networks of scholarship and artistic creation that rivaled those of the greatest universities and cultural centers of the medieval Islamic world. The expertise available within the palace walls was extraordinary, and her elevated position now provided access to these resources in ways that would have been impossible during her earlier years as a junior resident of the harem. Working with these scholars and artists also provided opportunities for intellectual growth that went far beyond the practical requirements of preparing for the Mughal ambassador's visit. Her conversations with palace historians opened up new perspectives on the Ottoman Empire's place within the broader sweep of Islamic civilization, while her collaborations with theologians deepened her understanding of the spiritual dimensions of the cultural traditions she was called upon to represent. Perhaps most significantly, these interactions helped her to develop a more sophisticated understanding of her own role within the imperial system. Rather than seeing herself primarily as a performer seeking advancement through individual achievement, she began to understand her position as part of a larger collective effort to maintain and develop the cultural traditions that legitimized Ottoman political authority throughout the Islamic world. This shifted perspective proved crucial during the actual reception for the Mughal ambassador, which took place in late spring amid circumstances that highlighted both the diplomatic importance of the occasion and the personal stakes involved for everyone who participated. The ambassador arrived with a retinue that included some of India's most accomplished scholars and artists, creating an atmosphere of cultural competition that elevated the entire event beyond routine diplomatic entertainment. The performance Layla delivered that evening represented the culmination of not only her intensive preparation, but also her evolving understanding of how individual excellence could serve broader cultural and political purposes. She began with a classical Arabic qasida that demonstrated the Ottoman court's connection to the foundational literary traditions of Islamic civilization, continued with Persian poetry that acknowledged the cultural debt that both the Ottoman and Mughal empires owed to Persian literary achievements, and concluded with Turkish compositions that showcased the distinctive contributions that Ottoman culture had made to the broader Islamic synthesis. But the evening's most significant moments came during the philosophical discussions that followed the formal performance, when she found herself engaging with the Mughal ambassador and his scholarly companions on questions that ranged from the relationship between earthly and divine love in mystical poetry to the role of cultural synthesis in creating imperial legitimacy. These conversations drew on all the intellectual preparation she had undertaken during her years in the palace, but they also required the kind of spontaneous insight and creative thinking that could not be rehearsed in advance. The success of the evening, measured both by the obvious satisfaction of the Mughal delegation and by the pleased reactions of Ottoman officials, marked another significant milestone in Layla's development as a cultural diplomat. But perhaps more importantly for her personal evolution, the event also demonstrated that her most effective performances occurred when she stopped trying to impress her audiences and instead focused on serving the larger purposes that her position was meant to advance. This realization proved transformative for her approach to all aspects of palace life. Rather than seeing each opportunity as a test of her individual worth, she began to understand her various roles as contributions to collective endeavors that were far more significant than any personal advancement she might achieve. The psychological relief that accompanied this shift in perspective was considerable, as it reduced the anxiety that had increasingly accompanied her public appearances, while also enhancing the effectiveness of her actual performances. The change in her approach did not go unnoticed by those around her, particularly the more experienced palace residents who had observed her evolution from frightened newcomer to accomplished cultural ambassador. Mihrima, whose guidance had been crucial throughout Layla's development, commented on the transformation during one of their regular study sessions. "You have discovered something that many people never learn during entire lifetimes of worldly success," she observed. "The paradox that we perform most effectively when we stop performing for ourselves and instead allow ourselves to become instruments for purposes larger than our own ambitions. This discovery marks the difference between mere competence and genuine mastery." The summer months that followed brought a series of diplomatic receptions and cultural events that provided opportunities to apply this new understanding in practical situations. Each occasion required the same careful preparation and flawless execution that had characterized her previous performances. But now, the process felt less like preparation for personal examination and more like contribution to ongoing efforts to maintain the empire's cultural prestige and diplomatic effectiveness. The most challenging of these events was a reception for representatives from several European courts, whose presence in Constantinople reflected the complex web of political and commercial relationships that connected the Ottoman Empire to Christian powers despite the religious differences that officially separated them. The cultural diplomacy required for such occasions was particularly delicate, as it had to demonstrate Ottoman sophistication while avoiding any appearance of compromising Islamic principles or acknowledging European superiority in any sphere. The musical program Layla developed for this reception included pieces that showcased the mathematical precision and geometric beauty that Islamic culture had contributed to world civilization, while her conversations with the European guests focused on topics like philosophy and astronomy, where Islamic scholars had made contributions that even Christian intellectuals were obliged to acknowledge. The evening's success helped to reinforce the Ottoman Empire's reputation as a center of learning and cultural achievement that commanded respect even from its political rivals. But the event also highlighted the psychological challenges that continued to accompany her elevated position within the palace hierarchy. The need to represent not only her own capabilities, but also the broader claims of Islamic civilization to intellectual and cultural superiority created pressure that was both motivating and exhausting. The stakes involved in each public appearance seemed to grow with each success, as failure became increasingly unthinkable, not only for personal reasons, but also because of the potential damage to causes and institutions that were far more important than her individual welfare. These pressures were compounded by changes in the harem's internal dynamics that reflected her rising status within the palace community. Women who had once treated her as an equal now approached her with the formal deference appropriate to someone whose position placed her closer to the centers of imperial power. While this recognition was gratifying in many ways, it also created a sense of isolation that was sometimes difficult to bear. The relationships that had sustained her during her earlier years in the palace necessarily evolved as her circumstances changed. Gulnar, who had served as mentor and surrogate mother figure during Layla's initial adjustment to harem life, now treated her with a mixture of maternal pride and respectful distance that reflected their changed relative positions. The easy intimacy of their early relationship had been replaced by something more formal, though no less genuine in its affection and concern. Even her friendship with Mihrima, which had been based on the older woman's role as teacher and Layla's position as eager student, required renegotiation as Layla's own expertise and experience began to approach levels that made genuine intellectual partnership possible. Their conversations became exchanges between equals rather than lessons delivered by superior to subordinate, a change that was welcome, but also required adjustment from both participants. Perhaps most challenging of all was navigating relationships with women who had once been peers, but who had not experienced similar advancement within the palace hierarchy. The mixture of genuine congratulation and inevitable resentment that characterized these relationships required constant sensitivity and diplomatic skill, as maintaining harmony within the harem community remained essential for everyone's welfare regardless of their individual positions. These social complexities were brought into sharp focus during the autumn of her 5th year, when news arrived that would affect not only her own situation, but the circumstances of women throughout the palace. The Sultan had decided to take a new wife, a decision that created ripple effects throughout the imperial household, as everyone tried to understand how this development might affect their own positions and prospects. The selection of a new imperial wife was always a momentous occasion within the palace, as it represented a reshuffling of the hierarchy that could create new opportunities for some women, while potentially diminishing the prospects of others. The identity of the chosen woman, her background and connections, her personal qualities and probable influence, all of these factors would shape the palace's social and political dynamics for years to come. In this case, the Sultan's choice fell upon a young woman who had arrived at the palace only 2 years earlier, but whose exceptional beauty and quick intelligence had rapidly elevated her within the harem hierarchy. Her selection represented both a triumph of merit over seniority and a reminder that in the world of imperial favor, dramatic changes in fortune could occur with little warning. For Layla, the Sultan's marriage decision created a complex mixture of emotions and calculations. On one hand, the elevation of someone from her own generation within the harem offered hope that advancement based on ability rather than mere longevity remained possible within the imperial system. The new wife's success demonstrated that the path to the highest positions remained open to those who could distinguish themselves through exceptional qualities. On the other hand, the presence of a new imperial wife inevitably shifted the balance of power within the palace in ways that could affect everyone's prospects. The new wife would bring her own supporters and allies into positions of influence, while also potentially viewing established figures like Layla as competitors who might need to be managed or marginalized to ensure her own security. The wedding celebrations themselves provided both spectacle and opportunity, as the palace's cultural resources were mobilized to create festivities worthy of the imperial dignity. Layla found herself called upon to contribute to entertainment programs that would demonstrate the court's magnificence to guests from throughout the empire and beyond, while also serving the practical purpose of integrating the new wife into the existing social structures of the palace community. The musical compositions she prepared for these celebrations required particularly careful thought, as they needed to honor the new imperial wife, while also maintaining the established protocols that governed such occasions. The balance between innovation and tradition was delicate, and the stakes were high given the number of important observers who would be evaluating every aspect of the festivities. The success of her contributions to the wedding celebrations earned recognition that extended her influence into new areas of palace cultural life. She was invited to participate in planning future ceremonial occasions, consulted on questions of musical and artistic policy, and included in discussions about cultural diplomacy that had previously been beyond her reach. But these new opportunities also brought fresh challenges and responsibilities that tested her evolved understanding of how to maintain authenticity while serving institutional purposes. The temptation to use her enhanced access to advance personal interests was considerable, yet she had learned that the most effective path to sustained influence lay in consistently prioritizing broader goals over narrow self-interest. As winter approached and the palace settled into its quieter seasonal rhythm, Layla found herself reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had brought her from rural obscurity to a position of genuine influence within one of the world's great imperial courts. 5 years earlier, she had been a frightened girl whose world extended no further than her family's modest holdings in the Anatolian countryside. Now she was a woman whose opinions carried weight in discussions of cultural policy, whose performances influenced diplomatic relationships between great powers, and whose success had opened pathways that might lead to even greater achievements. Yet the satisfaction these accomplishments provided was tempered by growing awareness of the costs that accompanied such elevation. The simplicity and emotional directness of her earlier life had been replaced by complexity and calculation that were necessary for survival at the heights of imperial society, but that sometimes left her feeling disconnected from the authentic self she had once known. The spiritual dimensions of these changes had become increasingly important to her, as she tried to maintain connection to values and purposes that transcended the immediate demands of palace life. Her study of mystical literature had evolved from academic exercise to genuine seeking, as she looked for ways to reconcile worldly engagement with deeper sources of meaning and satisfaction. The winter months provided time for the kind of contemplative practice that had been difficult to maintain during the busier seasons of diplomatic activity. She found herself drawn increasingly to the palace mosque during the quiet hours before dawn and after sunset, seeking in prayer and meditation the inner peace that complemented her external achievements. These spiritual practices also influenced her approach to the practical challenges of palace life, helping her to maintain perspective during difficult periods and to respond with wisdom rather than mere cleverness to the complex situations that regularly arose in her various roles. The integration of contemplative discipline with active engagement in worldly responsibilities represented a form of personal development that had been unimaginable during her early years in the harem. As spring returned, and the palace began to prepare for another season of diplomatic receptions and cultural celebrations, Layla felt ready to embrace whatever challenges and opportunities the coming months might bring. Her position within the imperial household was now secure enough to allow her to focus less on advancement and more on contribution, while her accumulated experience provided resources for handling even the most demanding situations with confidence and grace. The first major event of the new season was to be a reception for ambassadors from the Safavid Empire, whose presence in Constantinople reflected ongoing efforts to manage the complex relationship between the two great Shia and Sunni powers of the Islamic world. The cultural diplomacy required for such occasions was particularly delicate, as it had to acknowledge shared Islamic heritage while also maintaining the distinctions that justified the Ottoman Empire's claims to leadership within the broader Islamic civilization. Preparing for this reception required drawing upon all the skills and knowledge Layla had accumulated during her years of palace service, while also developing new insights into the theological and political dimensions of inter-Islamic diplomacy. The challenge was considerable, but she approached it with the confidence that came from having successfully navigated similar situations in the past, and the wisdom that had emerged from years of reflection on the deeper purposes that such events were meant to serve. As she began the intensive preparation that would occupy the weeks leading up to the reception, Layla reflected on how much her approach to such challenges had evolved since her early days in the palace, where once she had focused primarily on avoiding failure and seeking personal advancement, she now saw each opportunity as a chance to contribute to the maintenance and development of cultural traditions that were far more significant than any individual success or failure. This perspective brought both peace and energy to her work, as it reduced the anxiety that had once accompanied major performances, while also enhancing her effectiveness by allowing her to focus entirely on serving the purposes that such events were designed to advance. The paradox she had discovered, that the most successful performances occurred when the performer forgot about personal success, had become a guiding principle that influenced every aspect of her palace life. The preparation for the Safavid reception consumed the following weeks with an intensity that reminded Layla of her most challenging early experiences in the palace. Yet now, she approached the work with a seasoned understanding that transformed anxiety into focused determination. The theological complexities of Sunni-Shia relations required consultation with the palace's most learned Islamic scholars, while the musical program demanded pieces that could honor Persian cultural contributions without appearing to diminish Ottoman achievements. Her mornings were spent in intensive study of Persian mystical poetry, particularly the works of Rumi and Hafez, whose spiritual insights transcended sectarian boundaries and offered common ground for Islamic unity. The afternoons brought musical rehearsals that pushed her technical abilities to their limits, as she worked to master compositions whose intricate rhythms and melodic structures embodied centuries of Persian musical development. The evenings were devoted to conversations with palace officials, who helped her understand the diplomatic nuances that would shape every aspect of the reception. As the day of the event approached, Layla found herself experiencing not the terror that had once accompanied such occasions, but rather a deep sense of responsibility mixed with quiet confidence. She had learned to trust in the preparation process that had served her so well in previous diplomatic entertainments, while also remaining open to the spontaneous insights that often emerged during actual performances. The Safavid ambassador proved to be a man of extraordinary cultivation, whose knowledge of Islamic philosophy and poetry rivaled that of the most accomplished scholars in either empire. His presence created an atmosphere of intellectual intensity that elevated the entire reception, as the assembled guests recognized that they were witnessing not merely diplomatic entertainment, but a genuine exploration of the cultural foundations that united the Islamic world, despite its political divisions. When Layla began her performance that evening, singing a composition that wove together Sunni and Shia mystical traditions into a unified expression of Islamic spirituality, she felt herself entering a state of consciousness that transcended the usual boundaries between performer and audience, between individual achievement and collective experience. The music seemed to flow through her rather than from her, carrying meanings that surpassed anything that could be conveyed through words alone. The conversations that followed the formal performance reached depths of philosophical and theological discussion that surprised even the most experienced palace officials. The Safavid ambassador engaged with Layla on questions of Islamic unity and diversity, mystical experience and rational theology, the relationship between earthly power and spiritual authority, topics that had occupied Islamic thinkers for centuries, and that took on new relevance in the context of contemporary political realities. What made these discussions particularly remarkable was not their intellectual sophistication, considerable though that was, but rather their ability to create genuine moments of understanding between representatives of political entities that were often in conflict. Through the medium of shared cultural appreciation and mutual respect for learning, ancient antagonisms seemed to dissolve into recognition of common humanity and shared spiritual aspirations. The success of the reception resonated throughout the palace and beyond, as reports of the evening's cultural diplomacy reached courts throughout the Islamic world. For the Ottoman Empire, the event demonstrated that its claims to cultural leadership were grounded in genuine accomplishment rather than mere political assertion. For Layla personally, the reception marked her emergence as a figure of international significance, whose contributions to Islamic cultural unity were recognized far beyond the boundaries of her immediate environment. But perhaps the most important outcome of the evening was the sense of completion it brought to Layla's long journey from rural obscurity to imperial influence. As she reflected on what had transpired, she realized that she had finally discovered the synthesis between personal fulfillment and service to larger purposes that had eluded her during her earlier years of focused ambition. The performance had succeeded precisely because she had been able to forget herself entirely and become a vehicle for cultural and spiritual forces that were far greater than any individual talent or achievement. The months that followed brought a series of opportunities that built upon the reputation established during the Safavid reception. Invitations arrived from other Islamic courts requesting similar cultural exchanges, while within the Ottoman palace, her counsel was sought on questions ranging from the selection of court musicians to the development of educational programs for the imperial children. Her influence had evolved from that of skilled performer to trusted advisor, whose insights were valued across multiple areas of palace administration. Yet as autumn returned and she entered her 6th year in the palace, Layla found herself increasingly drawn to questions about the ultimate direction of her life and the purposes she wanted to pursue during whatever years remained to her. The success she had achieved was deeply satisfying, and the opportunities available to her seemed limitless within the context of imperial service. But she had also begun to sense that there might be other forms of fulfillment available beyond the boundaries of court life, other ways of serving the cultural and spiritual values that had become central to her identity. These reflections were deepened by conversations with Mihrima, whose own long experience in the palace had given her perspective on the full arc of a life spent in imperial service. The older woman had observed the rise and fall of countless individuals who had sought advancement through various paths, and her insights into the patterns that characterized successful careers were invaluable for anyone contemplating long-term planning. There comes a moment in every successful palace career, Mihrima observed during one of their winter conversations, when the individual must choose between continuing to accumulate positions and honors or beginning to use accumulated influence to create something that will outlast their own presence in this world. The first path leads to a kind of comfortable imprisonment, while the second opens possibilities for contribution that can extend far beyond the boundaries of any single lifetime. These words sparked extended reflection on the nature of legacy and the ways in which individual accomplishment could serve purposes that transcended personal ambition. Layla had achieved more than she had ever dreamed possible during her early years in the harem, but she was beginning to understand that true fulfillment might require moving beyond the accumulation of success toward the creation of institutions and tradition that could serve future generations. The opportunity to explore these possibilities came through an unexpected conversation with the Valide Sultan, who summoned Layla for a private audience during the quiet days of midwinter. The meeting took place in the same chambers where Layla had received her first major opportunity years earlier. But now, she entered as an established figure whose contributions to the palace's cultural life were widely recognized and valued. "Your accomplishments during these past years have exceeded our highest expectations," the Valide Sultan began, her tone carrying both satisfaction and calculation. "Your contributions to the empire's cultural diplomacy have enhanced our reputation throughout the Islamic world and beyond. But I believe you are now ready for responsibilities that extend beyond even these significant achievements." The proposal that followed was both thrilling and daunting. The Valide Sultan was inviting Layla to establish a new institution within the palace complex, a school for the advanced cultural education of women who showed exceptional promise for roles in diplomatic and administrative functions. The project would draw upon her accumulated expertise, while also allowing her to influence the development of future generations of women who might serve the empire's cultural and political interests. The magnitude of this opportunity was almost overwhelming. To create an educational institution within the Ottoman palace system would represent a form of permanent contribution that could outlast any individual career or achievement. The women who graduated from such a program would carry its influence throughout the empire and beyond, creating networks of cultural sophistication that could serve Ottoman interests for decades or centuries to come. Yet the challenge was equally formidable. Establishing a new educational institution would require not only her personal commitment, but also the support of palace officials whose own interests might be affected by the changes such a program would create. The curriculum would need to balance traditional Islamic learning with the practical skills required for effective cultural diplomacy. The selection of students would require careful judgment, as the program's reputation would depend on the accomplishments of its graduates. As winter gave way to spring, Layla devoted herself to developing detailed plans for the proposed institution. Working with Mihrama and other experienced palace educators, she designed a program that would provide young women with the linguistic, literary, musical, and philosophical preparation necessary for advanced roles in cultural diplomacy. The curriculum would emphasize not only technical skills, but also the spiritual and ethical development that would enable graduates to serve as authentic representatives of Islamic civilization. The process of planning revealed new dimensions of the palace system that had been largely invisible during her earlier focus on individual advancement. The Ottoman court contained educational resources and institutional structures that rivaled those of the greatest universities and cultural centers throughout the world. The expertise available within the palace walls was extraordinary, and the potential for creating new institutions that could serve the empire's long-term cultural interests was limited only by imagination and political will. The formal establishment of the new institution required months of negotiation with palace officials, whose approval was necessary for such an ambitious project. Each conversation revealed new complications and opportunities, as various factions within the imperial administration saw different implications in the proposed program. Some officials recognized the potential diplomatic benefits of enhanced cultural education, while others worried about the resources required or the precedent that such innovation might establish. Through all these negotiations, Layla found herself drawing upon diplomatic skills she had developed during years of managing relationships within the harem community and representing the palace in cultural exchanges with foreign visitors. The ability to understand multiple perspectives simultaneously, to identify common interests that could bridge apparent conflicts, to present proposals in ways that appealed to diverse constituencies. All of these capabilities proved essential for advancing the institutional project through the complex approval process. The breakthrough came during a presentation to the Sultan himself, who had expressed interest in the educational proposal as part of his broader concern for maintaining Ottoman cultural leadership within the Islamic world. The meeting took place in the same private chambers where Layla had performed during her early rise to prominence. But now, she appeared as an institutional innovator, whose ideas could influence the empire's long-term development. The strength of our empire has always rested upon our ability to synthesize the best elements from all the cultures that contribute to our civilization. The Sultan observed, after reviewing the detailed plans for the new institution. An educational program that prepares women to serve as cultural ambassadors for this synthesis could enhance our influence throughout the known world while also demonstrating our commitment to the development of human potential regardless of gender. The imperial approval that followed this presentation marked the culmination of Layla's transformation from palace resident to institutional founder. The girl who had arrived 6 years earlier as tribute from a remote Anatolian village was now entrusted with creating an educational program that could influence the development of the Ottoman Empire for generations to come. The months that followed brought the intense work of translating approved plans into functioning reality. The selection of faculty required extensive consultation with scholars throughout the palace and beyond, as the program's success would depend upon bringing together the most accomplished experts in various fields of learning. The design of physical facilities demanded careful attention to both practical requirements and symbolic significance, as the spaces where learning occurred needed to embody the cultural values that the program was meant to transmit. Perhaps most challenging of all was the selection of the first class of students, young women whose potential for advanced cultural education had to be evaluated through methods that went far beyond the usual criteria applied to palace residents. The program would succeed or fail based upon the accomplishments of these initial graduates, making their selection a decision of enormous consequence for the institution's future reputation. As the new educational institution prepared to open its doors for the first time, Layla found herself experiencing a form of satisfaction that was qualitatively different from anything she had known during her years of individual advancement. The accomplishment of creating something that could serve purposes beyond her own lifetime provided a sense of meaning that transcended personal achievement, while the opportunity to influence the development of future generations offered the possibility of contribution that could extend far into the future. The opening ceremonies for the new institution brought together representatives from throughout the Islamic world, as news of the innovative educational program had spread beyond Ottoman borders and attracted attention from scholars and officials who recognized its potential significance. The presence of so many distinguished visitors created an atmosphere of international recognition that validated the empire's claims to cultural leadership, while also establishing expectations for the program's future accomplishments. During her address at the opening ceremonies, Layla reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment of institutional creation. 7 years ago, she began, I arrived at this palace as a young woman whose world extended no further than my family's modest holdings in rural Anatolia. The transformation that has brought me to this moment demonstrates not the power of individual ambition, but rather the potential that exists within the Ottoman system for developing human capabilities regardless of their original circumstances. She continued, the institution we inaugurate today represents our commitment to the belief that cultural understanding can serve as a bridge between peoples who might otherwise remain separated by political differences or religious distinctions. The women who graduate from this program will carry with them not only technical skills, but also the wisdom that comes from deep appreciation for the diversity and unity that characterize our shared human heritage. The years that followed saw the gradual development of the educational institution into one of the palace's most significant cultural assets. The graduates of its programs served with distinction in diplomatic functions throughout the Islamic world, while the reputation of their preparation attracted applications from young women across the empire who sought advanced cultural education. The success of the program enhanced Ottoman prestige, while also creating new possibilities for women's contribution to imperial service. For Layla personally, the establishment and development of the institution marked the completion of a transformation that had begun with her arrival as a frightened girl and culminated in her emergence as a creator of lasting cultural institutions. The path from rural obscurity to imperial influence had required not only the development of individual capabilities, but also the wisdom to understand how personal advancement could serve purposes that transcended narrow self-interest. As she entered the final phase of her active career in palace service, Layla found herself reflecting often on the lessons learned during her extraordinary journey through the Ottoman imperial system. The experience had taught her that genuine success required the integration of personal fulfillment with service to larger purposes, that individual excellence could serve as a foundation for institutional creation, and that the most lasting contributions came from enabling others to achieve their own potential, rather than simply accumulating personal honors and achievements. The rhythm of her daily life had evolved to reflect these insights. Her mornings were still devoted to the musical practice that had been central to her identity since her early days in the palace. But now, these sessions served as much for spiritual development as technical maintenance. The afternoons brought administrative responsibilities related to the educational institution, work that provided deep satisfaction through its contribution to the development of future generations of cultural leaders. The evenings often included conversations with current students and recent graduates, discussions that revealed the continuing evolution of the cultural synthesis that the Ottoman Empire represented. These young women brought fresh perspectives to traditional questions, while also demonstrating the effectiveness of the educational methods that had been developed through years of careful experimentation and refinement. As winter returned during her 10th year in the palace, Layla found herself preparing for a transition that would mark another significant phase in her continuing development. The educational institution had achieved sufficient success and stability to function effectively under the leadership of her most accomplished former students, while her own interests were increasingly drawn toward the contemplative practices that had provided spiritual foundation throughout her years of worldly engagement. The decision to request permission for partial retirement from active palace service was not made lightly, as it represented a choice to prioritize spiritual development over continued accumulation of worldly achievement. Yet the example of figures like Mihrima, who had successfully balanced contemplative practice with institutional contribution, suggested that such a transition could serve both personal fulfillment and continued service to the values that had guided her career. The request was granted with expressions of gratitude that reflected recognition of her extraordinary contributions to Ottoman cultural life. The Valide Sultan's final audience with her was held in the same chambers where their relationship had begun a decade earlier. But now, the conversation was between two women who had worked together to enhance the empire's cultural resources in ways that would influence its development for generations to come. Your legacy extends far beyond your individual accomplishments, the Valide Sultan observed during their farewell conversation. The institution you created will continue to serve the empire's cultural interests long after those of us who established it have been forgotten. The young women who carry forward the methods you developed will influence the development of Islamic civilization in ways that we cannot imagine but can trust will honor the values we have sought to preserve and transmit. As Layla prepared to begin the next phase of her life, focused on contemplative practice while maintaining advisory connections to the educational institution she had founded, she reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her from rural Anatolia to the heart of one of the world's great empires. The transformation had required not only the development of individual capabilities, but also the wisdom to understand how personal growth could serve purposes that transcended the boundaries of any single lifetime. The girl who had once tended sheep in her father's fields had become a woman whose influence extended throughout the Islamic world, and whose contributions to cultural education would continue long after her own earthly journey had concluded. The path had been neither straight nor predictable, requiring constant adaptation to changing circumstances and evolving opportunities. But it had led to forms of fulfillment that surpassed anything she could have imagined during those early days of fear and homesickness in the imperial harem. As the sun set over Constantinople on her final day of active palace service, Layla stood at the window of her chambers looking out over the city that had become her home, and the water that connected the Ottoman Empire to the wider world beyond. The lights beginning to twinkle in the distance represented thousands of individual lives, each pursuing their own dreams and struggling with their own challenges, each part of the vast human tapestry that she had been privileged to serve through her work in cultural diplomacy and educational innovation. The call to evening prayer echoed across the city, as it had every day since her arrival a decade earlier, marking the rhythm that had structured her life and provided spiritual foundation for all her worldly activities. As she prepared to answer that call one more time as an active resident of the imperial palace, she felt profound gratitude for the opportunities that had been granted to her and deep peace about the path that lay ahead, whatever forms it might take in the years of contemplative service that awaited her.